next speaker, which is Dr. Barry Sears, that is the president of the Anti-Inflammatory Foundation and Zone Labs, who has been developing the Zone diet, among other things, and more recently the Resolution Zone that is bringing the topic of the Zone diet into anti-inflammatory and pro-resoleuomic pathways, and we've been collaborating for many years. We came on anti-inflammatory strategies and modulation of inflammation from the stem cell therapy and tolerance induction area, and Dr. Sears has been working a lot on obesity prevention, metabolic syndrome, and impact on diabetes and chronic degenerative disease conditions. So we had a very productive collaboration in the years, and thank you for being here.
Well, it's a great pleasure being here, and as Camilo has said, we've worked for a long time asking some unique questions about the role of nutrition and hormones and gene expression. And I'll try to explain a little of this in this presentation. And really talking about the role of omega-3 fatty acids in tissue regeneration. Over a decade ago, Time magazine ran this as their cover story, talking about the secret killer, the surprising linkage between inflammation, heart attacks, cancer, Alzheimer's, and other diseases, of which we can include autoimmune diseases. We're led to believe that inflammation is a bane that should be eradicated from our systems. On the contrary, inflammation keeps us alive. You need a zone. If you had too little of an inflammatory response, your body becomes an easy target, a sitting target for microbes and physical injuries. They would never heal. But if the inflammatory response to those injuries is too strong or not turned off or resolved, then the body begins to attack itself. So what your goal is not looking for anti-inflammatory responses, but maintaining the inflammatory response within a therapeutic zone, not too high, but not too low. And that's why there's two unique phases of the inflammatory response. All initially starts with injury. It could be external or internal. But whatever the cause of that injury, it will initiate an inflammatory response that gives rise to the classic damage that we associate with inflammation. But there's a totally separate response to this, which I term as the resolution response, which basically resolves the inflammation and sets the stage for the eventual healing of the tissue. We can look at this resolution response almost like from a cartoon figure thinking of a gyroscope. It's basically a continuing balance between hormones and gene transcription factors. The hormones called eicosanoids, these are the hormones that turn on the inflammatory response. The hormones called resolvins are the hormones that turn it off. But the key players are really nuclear factor kappa B, which is the primary gene transcription factor that activates the immune response. And this is counterbalanced by another gene transcription factor, AMPK. This is the master genetic switch of metabolism and cellular repair. You need all four of these working in unison to maintain a state of wellness. Because if you don't, then basically you have set the stage for the development of chronic disease. And these components are, as we talked about, the hormones, the eicosanoids, they are critically important in terms of the initiation of the inflammatory response. But again, the resolvins, these are the hormones derived from omega-3 fatty acids, are the ones that basically resolve the inflammation. And the NF-kappa B, that's your master switch of inflammation, and the resulting cytokines that give rise to basically the inflammatory response, whereas AMP kinase or AMPK is the master switch of basically metabolism and the turning off and repairing of damaged tissue. So when we talk about this resolution response, we're talking about a continuing dynamic balance of hormones and genes that can be controlled by the diet, if you're willing to treat diet like a drug. Healing, which is often a highly controversial way to say what is actual healing, healing can be viewed as a on-demand response. That basically injuries will occur at random. But the resolution response has to be on demand to basically address the inflammatory response caused by that injury. But each step of this resolution response, which I'll go into a little more detail, can be blocked by dietary factors because it's a very highly orchestrated series of events. If that series of events is not basically taken to completion, then healing and the repair of tissue will not take place. From a temporal standpoint, we can look at the resolution in 3 phases. One, we can look at the initiation, the classical signs of swelling, pain, followed by now the resolution. Each of the one is a sequential aspect. And if any of these stages are broken down, or attenuated, or blocked, then the final healing process, returning the body to homeostasis, equilibrium, will not be achieved. But that's what, under an ideal, what should happen. But what really happens? We have a physical injury. Again, either external or internal. This will give rise to an inflammatory response. That keeps us alive. But the resolution response is blocked. And if that is blocked in any way, then the healing itself of that injury will also be blocked. What happens in this response is now that with the blockage of the resolution response, you start to build up cellular inflammation. This is inflammation that's below the perception of pain. You can measure it, but you can't feel it. And this inflammation can now linger and basically become now the growing basis of virtually all chronic disease states, as talked about in that Time magazine article more than a decade ago. As bad as that situation is, it can be basically enhanced by diet-induced inflammation. One of the primary causes of inflammation in our society today is the diet. And this diet-induced inflammation, the primary poster child of this would be insulin resistance. So as you build up insulin resistance, now you're basically accelerating the development of unresolved cellular inflammation, accelerating the development of a wide variety of chronic disease states. From a graphical standpoint, think of this as simply a kitchen sink. Ideally, if the sink is working well, the water goes in and the water goes out. But what happens if the drain is blocked? Well, the water will start building up. This is their unresolved inflammation. Not to enough of an extent that you basically feel any pain or have any organ damage, but you're no longer well. But if you turn on the faucet, diet-induced inflammation, then basically the sink will fill at a faster rate and spill over, and that's what we call chronic disease. So from the standpoint, you cannot dissociate diet from looking at basically modulating the inflammatory response. And that's why when we talk about tissue healing, we're really talking about multi-component systems. There are no magic bullets in nutrition, but there are appropriate orchestrations. And you're looking to get into what I call a zone where basically those hormonal and genetic factors are now balanced on a continual basis. No one item will do that. But again, each one can contribute. One is the diet. I've talked about the zone diet because it's a diet that was designed and tested to treat insulin resistance. It's a calorie-restricted diet. It's highly defined, just as a drug. On the other hand, the omega-3 fatty acids are key because they are the building blocks of the hormones called resolvins. Without adequate levels of omega-3 fatty acids in the blood or the tissues, it is impossible to make adequate levels of these resolvins that turn off the inflammatory response. But that is still not sufficient because what you have to do is now heal the damaged tissue. And this becomes the role of these chemicals called polyphenols, the chemicals that give fruits and vegetables their color. Why they're important? Because they are activators of the gene transcription factor, AMPK. It's only when all three of these are working as a unified team can the healing process be accomplished. We can look at this almost like looking at the 3 R's. The zone diet, again highly defined, reduces diet-induced inflammation, and particularly insulin resistance. The omega-3 fatty acids, they resolve residual cellular inflammation, and the polyphenols repair the damage caused by the cellular inflammation. But I'll spend the rest of this talk talking really about the omega-3 fatty acids because they are really the central hub of this resolution response. We often have a misconception about inflammation. We think of it as a burning log that burns out into embers. It's a wonderful analogy. Unfortunately, it's totally wrong. Inflammation, once started, will continue until resolved. These are separate active metabolic steps. And so, though this is a nice image, it has no bearing to reality. And that's why the understanding and discovery of these resolvins gave a new understanding of how the control process of inflammation actually takes place. The resolvins come from the omega-3 fatty acids. It's a very tortuous pathway, but you have to have adequate levels of these omega-3 fatty acids, both EPA and DHA, in the blood and the tissues. Without these levels, it is impossible to make the appropriate resolvins to activate now the resolution process. There's a wide variety of resolvins, and they have unique receptors. So you can't just say, I will only use one omega-3 fatty acid and not another. You need a combination of both. But some omega-3 fatty acids, which are often not well understood. One, you cannot make eicosanoids from DHA. You can only make eicosanoids from EPA, the omega-3 fatty acid, or arachidonic acid. These are the drivers of inflammation. The eicosanoids derived from arachidonic acid, or AA, are strongly pro-inflammatory. The eicosanoids derived from EPA, they're not anti-inflammatory, but they are weakly pro-inflammatory, perhaps 100 times less strong. So in comparison, they look less inflammatory, but they are not anti-inflammatory. On the other hand, it's the resolvins, which basically drive the resolution process. And now basically you need both EPA and DHA. But the question is, at what levels? We can get a rough idea of this by looking at the blood. We can measure the ratio of two fatty acids in the blood. One is arachidonic acid, that is derived from omega-6 fatty acids, and the other is the EPA, the omega-3 fatty acid. The balance of these two fatty acids are a more sophisticated aspect of looking at simply, we're not looking at the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, but looking at the building blocks of the hormones from omega-6 to omega-3. So the ratio of these two fatty acids will give you a very unique insight into the levels of cellular inflammation in the body at that point in time. And what are some of the benefits of having a low ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA? Well, first of all, as I'll show shortly, it is the best marker we have of inflammatory cytokines. The lower the level of omega-3 fatty acids to arachidonic acid, the less cytokines are being pushed out by nuclear factor kappa B. Now, it's led us to believe that basically omega-3 fatty acids are anti-inflammatory, but really, it's really the resolvins acting through the final aspect of the resolution response that turn off nuclear factor kappa B. So by reducing this ratio, you reduce the intensity of the initial inflammatory response. And at the same time, you accelerate the resolution of inflammation. What are appropriate ratios? Well, Camille has talked about this already. Ideally between about 1.5 and 3. This is what you find in the Japanese population. And these are the people who have the longest lifespan in the world, the lowest rates of heart disease, and the lowest rates of depression. Well, could you go lower? You possibly could. You could lower it less than 1, but now you run the risk of potential bleeding and potential depression of the initial immune response. What happens if you go the other direction? You begin to move out of a therapeutic zone. If you can maintain it between 3 and 6, that's good. Not ideal, but good. But what happens is you get higher levels. Now your cellular inflammation is becoming higher and now becoming systemic. And for the American population, the ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA is about 20, which says we already have very, very high levels of inflammation. Not just now, but as I'll show you, 30 years ago. So this has been an epidemic building for over the last 30 years. And here's the article. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine 30 years ago. These were researchers who were the early pioneers in cytokine research, asking the question, what would happen if I gave high-dose omega-3 fatty acids? high dose being 5 grams of EPA and DHA per day. Now we can look at the ratio of arachidonic acid EPA in these healthy subjects 30 years ago. And you can see it's already highly elevated. Now as you give that level of omega-3 fatty acids, within about 10 weeks, the ratio is reduced by 90%. But once you stop the supplementation, it returns back to baseline. Nothing interesting about that per se. What was interesting was the effect on cytokines. That as you basically reduce the ratio of arachidonic acid EPA, you see a significant reduction of all cytokines. These are inflammatory mediators that are basically activated by once you turn on nuclear factor kappa B. In particular, things such as tumor necrosis factor, but as well as IL-6 and IL-1. And once you stop the supplementation, they return to baseline. So the question is, how much omega-3 fatty acids do you need to basically be in that ideal range between 1.5 and 3? The answer is, it depends. It depends how much inflammation you have and where it's located. Let's assume that you're well, by however you want to define that. Most people define it, I don't have a chronic disease. Then you might need about 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day. But what if you aren't well? What if you're obese? You have heart disease or diabetes, type 2. Then the levels that get that ratio of arachidonic acid EPA is now higher. Approximately double that dose, about 5 grams per day. Exactly the same dose used 30 years ago in that study reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. But what if you have an autoimmune disease, like type 1 diabetes? The levels are higher, about 7.5 grams per day. And what now if the inflammation is inside the central nervous system? You have depression, ADHD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis. The levels are still higher. Make no mistake about it, these are high levels, but they're also therapeutic levels. If you give a placebo dose, you will get placebo effects. We've heard about vitamin D. All the studies say, what if they were using placebo levels? You would expect placebo results. But what if you give a therapeutic level? It's not a therapeutic level by saying what the dose should be, it's what the blood tells you you are. And that's why it's titrating the goal when you use nutritional intervention has to be the key. You set a goal and basically titrate, taking into account the individuality of the patients. Now, if it's just a matter of more omega-3 fatty acids, why not simply eat more fish? Remember, if you're healthy, you probably need about 2.5 grams per day. Your grandparents knew this when they gave your parents a tablespoon of cod liver oil, the world's most disgusting agent known to man. But it was standard issue. No child in Europe or America could leave the house unless they had a tablespoon of cod liver oil. That contained about 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids. Today, the average intake in Americans are about 125 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids per day. That's a 95% reduction. So perhaps I can just eat more fish. So if I want to get 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day, how much fish would I need? You could eat 3 kilograms of lobster every day for the rest of your life. It's expensive, and after a couple of days, pretty boring. I could eat maybe a tuna, maybe only a kilogram per day. I have a problem. The tuna is basically highly contaminated with mercury, and we're told not to eat tuna for very good reasons. Well, perhaps I'll eat salmon. It has more omega-3 fatty acids, but 95% of all salmon today is farm-raised salmon. And what they use is crude fish oil, which is very rich in another toxin called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. And so you're in a horns of a dilemma. To get more omega-3 fatty acids, I may bring in large amounts of toxins into the body which are persistent. And also from the standpoint, it's difficult to eat that amount of fish. And this is only to get 2.5 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids. If you're a type 1 diabetic, you might need 7.5 grams This is mission impossible. It simply can't be done. And that's why the use of high-dose but purified omega-3 concentrates are a way out of this potential dilemma. There are 3 types of omega-3 fatty acid products available in the world today. One I call health food grade. You go to the health food store, and there it is. These are lower in potency, between 15 and 60% omega-3 fatty acids. The 15% is cod liver oil. You can get higher concentrations, but there are basically standards, worldwide trading standards for all edible oils, purity and rancidity. Well, in terms of all fish are contaminated with PCBs. You can run, but you can't hide. So the levels of PCBs, the standard levels are 1 gram of fish oil capsule you can buy in a health food store might contain about 90 nanograms of PCBs. That's about the same amount of adding 1 drop of water to 5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's not very much, but it's enough to basically increase heart disease significantly. And the rancidity standards, which are used for all edible oils, says if it's more than 26 milliequivalents, it's unsuitable for human consumption. But we do have now pharmaceuticals, and they have a higher concentration, greater than 75% omega-3 fatty acids, and slightly better purity. These are the standards set by the FDA that for selling a pharmaceutical fish oil preparation, it cannot have more than 50 nanograms per gram of PCBs. And the rancidity levels, exactly the same as soybean oil or any other oil sold on the bulk commodities. But there's a new class of fatty acids. They're called ultra-refined. They're also high in omega-3 fatty acids, but incredibly lower in PCBs. It requires brand new manufacturing technologies only developed in the last few years to be able to reduce the levels of PCBs. And also basically have a higher level, basically a lower level of standards for basically rancidity. Because these PCBs are toxins. Make no mistake about it. So a typical 1 gram capsule that you might find in a health food store might have 90 grams of PCBs, 90 nanograms of PCBs, and still being compliant, being suitable for human consumption. If you bought 4 pharmaceutical grade fish oil capsules, 4 of those might contain 100 nanograms. An ultra refined, you might consume 18 grams or 18 capsules to get the same levels of PCBs. This is important because, as I try to point out, to have any likelihood of success, you need high dose levels. And not high dose levels for a week or a month, but really for the rest of your life, to basically modulate these hormones. And so, again, the levels of PCBs are quite important. Now, here's a typical chromatogram of, again, a typical ultra-refined fish oil, and you can see it's even lower than the standards of 5, which says you could probably have 90 grams of such a fish oil before exceeding the limit of 90 nanograms. And why that's important, because in the state of California, there are laws. Any product that basically contains more than 90 nanograms of PCBs has to have a skull and crossbones on its label, because now it's considered a carcinogen. And this is why fish oil buyers or users have to be aware. This is something from Consumers Reports in 2012, looking at typical health grade fish oils. Here are natural brands. If you took more than 1 or 2 capsules, you'd be consuming more than 90 nanograms of PCBs. These are basically the primary fish oils that people buy. Other fatty acids or other products basically were unsuitable for human consumption because there are high levels of totox. So when people start going to health food stores saying they're all the same, that is not true. Basically, removing PCBs is a significant and formidable engineering task. So if you're going to use something on a lifetime basis, it has to be pure, because you have to be using high levels for really the rest of your life to modulate the immune response. But the omega-3 fatty acids are not the end of the process. They are a critical step. The end of the process, which is really tissue regeneration, is the activation of this gene transcription factor called AMP kinase. AMP kinase is one of the most complex agents, is one of the most early gene transcription factors, actually predates nuclear factor kappa B, but it controls every aspect of our metabolism, but in terms of both the catabolism and anabolism. And so you can see, once AMP kinase is activated, the red dots are things which are turned off. The green are turned on. Let's make it simpler. Here are some of the consequences of basically a decreased AMP kinase activity. And virtually every chronic disease marker we look at can be traced back to a decreased activity of AMPK. The drug industry knows this. They've been trying for nearly 50 years to try to find drugs that activate AMP kinase. There's only one right now in large-scale use, and it's not a very good one. It's called metformin. Metformin activates AMP kinase by poisoning the mitochondria. It might be a short-term approach, but not a long-term approach. But other than that, the drug industry has been totally basically fruitless and basically say, can I find something that activates AMP kinase? This is one of the goals of, we know a couple of things do. Calorie restriction does activate AMP kinase, but people whine. I'm hungry all the time. So you say, this may not work. We know the polyphenols, especially those that get in the blood, activate AMP kinase. But the goal of the POSEIDON study is saying, what if? And the data is clear on Resolvins and potentially suggestive on vitamin D. What if they also activate AMP kinase? This begins to explain wide effects. Because again, simply stopping inflammation has nothing to do with the repair process. But if Resolvins and vitamin D are activating AMP kinase, then it begins to make a story that holds together. And this is one of the goals of the POSEIDON trial, to see what are the effects of each one by themselves and in concert. And there are many basically dietary inhibitors of AMPK. Here's one, high glucose levels. How do you define diabetes? High glucose levels. And that's why diabetics have low levels of AMPK activity. It's very difficult to ascertain because it doesn't circulate in the blood. You have to do muscle biopsies. But when you do, the levels of AMPK activity in diabetics is very, very low. Another aspect is excessive calorie intake. How do you know if you're taking in excess calories? You have excess body fat. So we look around America and say, we have a problem in terms of excess calorie intake. Two things which basically shut down AMP kinase activity. But these can only be controlled by the diet. But we also have those other factors we talked about, hormonal, that basically can activate. So now, how's this apply to the POSEIDON trial, at least the arm of the omega-3 fatty acids? This is suggested data starting back in 2011 that taking of a genetically engineered animal called the FAT1 mouse. These animals are genetically engineered to convert omega-6 fatty acids into omega-3. And their levels of arachidonic acid to EPA in the blood are approximately 1. These animals be almost impervious when crossbred to basically genetically bred animals who develop disease states of getting those disease. And likewise here, it protects against STZ, destruction of the beta cells. Now, obviously, genetic engineering is not feasible in today's society. But the data, the articles that Camilo talked about, very suggestive. Again, what if you basically looking for improvement of survival of beta cells when they're being destroyed by agents such as STZ? This is the slide that Camilo showed, that in the absence of omega-3 fatty acids, complete destruction of the alpha beta cells. In the presence of high levels, you seem to have survival. Now, what levels were they using? 3,600 milligrams per kilogram. It's a very high level, but nonetheless, the results, at least in mice, were very, very suggestive. So, what will be the POSEIDON protocol? We're not doing it 3,600 milligrams per kilogram. That'd be a lot of fish oil. but we are looking at about 150 milligrams per kilogram. For the 70 kilogram man, that's going to translate into about 7.5 grams per day. But again, as with the vitamin D, you're titrating the goal. This will be the starting dose. And throughout the course of the study, the patients will be analyzed for the ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA. Requires only a drop of blood. But it allows you now to titrate the goal. Try to keep the ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA between 1, 1.5, and 3. Just like the 2 case studies that Camila showed, that if you can do that, there seems to be regeneration, or at least improvement of C-peptide output. Also, we'll be using ultra-refined fish oils. Why? It makes no sense to try to poison the poor subjects as you're trying to basically improve their beta cell function. And again, it's titrating the goal, both with vitamin D and also with the omega-3 fatty acids. Because the endpoints, the primary endpoint of the POSEIDON trial is beta cell regeneration. Do I see increases in C-peptide? Now, it could be because I'm regenerating beta cells or I'm somehow removing some inhibitory aspect, but again, the beta cells are performing better. And so basically it is tissue regeneration and really beta cell regeneration or improvement in function that's the primary outcome for the POSEIDON trial. Very, very difficult primary endpoint, but obviously a very important one. And so as we go through and look at the effect of diet, we have to transcend looking at this as, quote, a nutrient, or think of it as a drug. We're really talking about genetic modulation. Genetic modulation that allows you to modulate the immune response. Because we have our inflammatory genes and our repair genes deeply embedded in our DNA. Now, we have not done a very good job of trying to activate those with drugs. But there are natural activators that we can use. No one will be sufficient by itself, but they work as a system. The more they work together, the more effective will be the outcome. And the outcome for the POSEIDON trial is looking at increase in beta cell function. And if that is achieved, then we can begin adding more aspects. We're only looking at one of the 3. That is one, the omega-3 fatty acids and the vitamin D. But the 2 other ones which we know activate AMP kinase, calorie restriction and polyphenols, if the POSEIDON trial is successful, is saying I can begin to add more nutrients that have a very, very high therapeutic index approaching infinite. So I know to put all my eggs in one basket. But first steps first. If you can basically now show with vitamin D, high dose, titrated to goal, high dose omega-3 fatty acids, titrated to goal, that there's an improvement in beta cell function, then there are more tools you can bring to bear to ask the question, can we basically truly reverse beta cell function, improve outcome, and say, what's the applicability to other autoimmune disease states? The answer is potentially infinite. So pro-resolution is, again, this resolution response is a very tightly integrated aspect. You're looking for, if you want tissue regeneration, you have to optimize this response. It requires continuous hormonal and genetic control. And if you want beta cell regeneration, you're going to have to activate AMP kinase. But high-dose omega-3 fatty acids will be central to generating and maintaining that optimal resolution response. Thank you very much.